Welcome to Storycomic Presents, where we interview amazing storytellers and artists. This is episode 362. I'm your host, Barney Smith of Storycomic.com, and we're honored to have with us the award-winning writer and celebrated illustrator of the life and times of Alexander Twilight, Bill Tulp. Bill.
Hi, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. Yeah. So as we mentioned at the beginning, you are the author and illustrator of the life and times of Alexander Twilight. And this isn't your first foray into making graphic novels or writing, but this is something that seems this is something that you've kind of became a passion project for you. So I guess my first question to you is what initially drew you to Alexander Twilight's story, and what inspired you to create a graphic biography about his life?
Alexander Twilight is kind of like a central figure at the old Stonehouse Museum up in Brownington, Vermont. And I worked up at the old Stonehouse Museum. My wife was actually education director up there. And so I learned a lot about him, and they talk a lot about him up there, and they take tours through the museum. And I thought he was an interesting figure. And then the museum opened a grant. It was called an Open for Interpretation grant, where they were looking for artists to interpret either Alexander Twilight or something about the museum. And I thought about it, and I thought it would be a neat idea to make a graphic biography of Alexander Twilight. So I kind of took that on, and so through the grant, I got money to do it, and then I got money to publish it. So it was kind of an incentive to do that. And he's actually a pretty interesting figure. But they got money through the Vermont Arts Council and the Northeastern Development Association. But I thought Alexander Twilight was like an interesting character. His main claim to fame nowadays is that he was the first person of African American descent to graduate from an American college, Middlebury, in 1823. He lived from 1795 to about 1853. And he was also the first person of African American descent to serve in a state legislature. So, that's how a lot of people know him. But he's actually a pretty interesting and dynamic figure up there. He started there in 1829. He was asked to be the principal or the headmaster of the Orleans County Grammar School. He was also a teacher, and he became the acting minister of the Brownington Congregational Church there. So he was kind of taking on quite a lot at the time. So he came there, and when he was there, he was known as a progressive educator. He believed that teaching our youth was the most important job you could have. And he kind of had an emphasis on educating teachers, educating students to become teachers. He encouraged students to learn about the natural world and science. He liked to use hands-on experiments. He also injected humor into what he was doing. He liked to do practical jokes. He could be demanding and strict, but that was kind of par for the course at the time that he was teaching. But despite that, he was able to earn the students' respect because he set a good example. He was hardworking. He was always fair with the students, and he liked working hard and playing hard. And he was like determined, and he basically accomplished anything he set out to do. So, he had a lot going on when he was there. Him and his wife, Mercy, they didn't have any children of their own, but they were known as Father and Mother Twilight to about 3,000 kids, 3,000 youth that went through there. And also, I should mention that a grammar school at this time wasn't like the grammar schools we have now. Like grammar schools we have now are young kids. So grammar school could be anywhere from a 5-year-old to like a 25
Oh
year
wow.
old.
Okay.
And they had like, classes together. So the older students might do some teaching of the younger students. Alexander Twilight actually went through a grammar school when he was about like 18 years old. And in the grammar school, he got 2 years of grammar school and he got his first 2 years of college. So when he went to Middlebury College, he only had 2 years left to 2 years left to go. He was an architect of the Old Stonehouse Museum, which is a 4-story granite dorm that's that's the kind of mainstay of the museum right now. And I'll get more into that later, but that was one of his accomplishments. He was well respected for getting things done, but his determination and stubbornness also earned him some enemies or detractors. For example, when he went to go get funding he wanted to do this 4-story dormitory, and he went to get funding for it, and he was denied by the board. And one of the one of the reasons he was denied was because a lot of the residents of Brownington made extra money from boarding students. So they didn't really want, you know, to build a dormitory there because they'd lose money. But at the
Okay.
same time, like even though they denied it, he had some he had some members of the grammar school that sorry, discreetly authorized a loan to certain individuals for the funding for the grammar school, but not discreetly. Um, but he managed to do a lot of the funding himself at the time. He had a special interest in something called natural theology, which proves the existence of God from evidence of the beauty and order of the natural world.
Mm.
And at the time, there was something that was called the Second Great Awakening going on. That were a lot of revivals that were going on. And in those, he brought a lot of people to Brownington for repentance and conversion. And those were big things where, they were really loud and vocal and people wanted to be saved. And they'd get up and yell and scream. And some of the more traditional members of the community really didn't like that aspect of what he was doing. So he was a very colorful character at the time. Um, so basically, that's a lot of why I thought he was an interesting character to do a story about.
Because you illustrated this, and you
Mhm.
chose to use an India ink wash rather than straight black and white. So, what influenced your artistic decision, and how do you think the India ink wash kind of enhances the story?
Um, well, I wanted to use the Indian ink wash because before, when I've done stories, I've just done it in straight black and white in India ink. But
Mm.
at that time, you didn't really have, years ago, you didn't have the printing capabilities to really do an ink wash or God, anything else. So this, I wanted more of the subtleties instead of having to do the cross hatching, the straight blacks and whites. I wanted to have the subtleties and to actually get in there
And I think it worked well, the black and white and the ink washes because I used a lot of, old illustrations and pictures that kind of went along with that.
Right. So you also won an award for this book. You won the IPNE, that's the Independent Publishers of New England award for the young adult category,
Yes.
which is a great achievement. And so, like, my question is, how do you feel about the recognition, and what impact do you hope it'll have on young readers?
Oh, well, that's another reason that I that I did the book
Hmm.
was or why I made it a graphic biography was I wanted to introduce both young people and anybody to Alexander Twilight in a more accessible form than they'd had before, because I had to work with the museum staff, and Bob Hunt at the museum gave me a lot of articles. So anyway, I worked real closely with the museum staff and other people. I worked with Bob Hunt or Bill Hart too, at the who's a professor emeritus of history and Black Studies at Middlebury College, and he's a Twilight expert. And what I did was I, put together what I could find, and I tried to compile it into a easily readable story. And then I took the articles. I took old pictures, and I used them, old pictures, old illustrations, and tried to compile what I could from there. And I took that and I sent drafts of it to those two people, plus a bunch of other people at the museum and other people that knew about Twilight or Vermont history. And those drafts went back and forth and back and forth, and I had to change a lot of things. And mostly I didn't have to change it after I had already done it, but there was a couple places where I had to change it after. When he was at Middlebury College, I had a scene where there was like men and women in the classroom, and I got a reply back that woman didn't come to the college until about 20 years later or something like that. So that's another thing. I use the Indian ink wash, but I also use micro pens, and I use those for the I don't use those for the lettering, and I also use those for, like, the thin lines and things like that. And so they have different thicknesses in there. And I also used whiteout, but I've used whiteout before, but a lot of times in whiteout, you're not just completely whiting something out. You're like altering it so you can, change what it looks like. If you get something too dark, you can kind of do a whiteout wash over it, or kind of play with it, so you can get, different effects. You're not just whiting things out.
Right.
And then I also there was a few places where I just used like a mechanical pencil, where especially on the lines of a building where I wanted it to be, the slating or the bricks or something, where I wanted a thin line, but I didn't want it to be really dark. And so that kind of lightened up the lines that I could put out there.
Well, hey there. If you're enjoying our podcast, don't forget to subscribe on YouTube or leave us a 5-star review on your favorite podcast platform. Your support means the world to us and helps us keep this show going. We love hearing from you, so any feedback is welcome. And thank you for being a part of our podcast family and for all your support. It truly means a lot to us. Alexander Twilight Day has been celebrated in Vermont since 2020.
Yes.
And so how do you see your book contributing to the understanding and the celebration of his legacy?
Well, I'm hoping to get it more into the schools, get people to
Okay.
know more about him. I still talk about him. There's still quite a few people in Vermont that don't know who he is, um, but they're more likely to know who he is, now, because there is the Alexander Twilight Day, and it's a Vermont state holiday. He also
Mhm.
has his portrait in the State House. I think that was in 2022. Um, the Katie Rundy painted that from. She used the same one picture of Twilight that
Right.
I used to do that. So if you go to the State House and you turn right to the right, it's right up
Right.
there in front in the State House. But
Oh,
I just think he's an interesting character. I think part of being the recognized as the first African American or black is one thing, but he had a lot of, like, if that had been all of it, he wouldn't necessarily have been an interesting story. Just like he just seemed to be a real interesting character, and a lot of his students really respected him and what he did. And
right.
one of the pages in there, I actually have notes from the students, and that's just a portrait of him, and it just has a. And I wanted some way to, illustrate, what the students were saying about him. So that page is a
Right.
little bit different than some of the other ones.
For our listeners, do you want to describe what we're looking at here in the slide that we're looking at?
That's a page from the book.
Okay.
And so I actually did the cover last.
Oh,
And,
okay.
and I was looking at, like, if you do the cover last, I think a lot of artists like to do that. Then they can kind of use, they can look through it and they can find something that'll work really well. This is actually like a scene where he was actually asked to leave he was having some problems at, at the grammar school, and he was actually asked to leave for a few years.
Oh, wow.
But things didn't go well when he wasn't there, and so he was asked to come back, and he was like, for the last few years of his life, he came back, and but at that time there was other economic things going on, and it never really got going again. But
Wow.
as I said, he had his really admirers, but he also had his detractors. So he has a interesting aspects to his life. He taught up in Canada for a while and had a couple schools up there, and then he was asked to come back. Well, this is supposed to be him coming back, and this is his home and where he's supposed to be.
And you did mention before as also as like this was the what we're looking at now as a photograph.
It's a daguerreotype.
Okay.
It's the only known photograph of him, and his wife had one of those too. So that's what I had to work from. That's what the painter that did the portrait of the State House had to work from.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and whether he identified as black or African American is there's kind of a lot of dispute
Mm.
over that.
Right.
So you can kind of look at his features and kind of decide for yourself. His father was biracial, and so then he was biracial.
Mm.
And he was
And,
in the census when his father was still alive. He was in the census as other than white, but then later on he was in the census as white. So he was,
right. And
you
so
know,
and now we're looking at sketches that you did based off of that one image you only had. So then you were working on um, finding different angles and different expressions. Is that
yeah,
what we're looking at here?
yeah, I tried to use that, and he was supposed to have a sense of humor. So it's like, you know, in a lot of those portraits, you get, you know, they have to sit there for I don't know how long, and
Right.
you know, you always think everybody was really stern and strict back then, but it's mostly because of the way they took the photographs.
Right. Yeah.
But you know, but those were just sketches I did, and I was just trying to, you know, get them in different moods and stuff. And that was before I actually started working on the pictures.
Okay.
And then the
Yeah.
next one, and this is a picture of Alexander Twilight. And this is a desk that's still at the museum. And it's actually a museum and historic village. And so there's a lot of buildings from the time period, but there's also buildings that have been brought in from the other places from the time period. So it's a real interesting place to go, and you can get tours of the museum if you go up there, and they have a lot of different programs up in
Mm.
Brownington, Vermont. But this is him sitting at his desk, and they still have his desk that he worked at the museum. And and
And
then
then we're
next,
looking at a sample of, but you kind of focused on his dad first, correct?
yeah, I think the first 3 pages are his dad, Ichabod Twilight. And I was going to start with Alexander, but his father was like biracial. Both his parents died when he was like really young. I be, sounds like he most likely became an indentured servant, which is interesting because Alexander Twilight did also became an indentured servant later. Um, and then he was in the Revolutionary Army. I don't know if he served any wartime or not. But then shortly after that, Alexander, well, before they were living, he was actually living in New York. Anyway, the Fugitive Slave Act um, was legislated into being, and that said if your slave escaped from you, you were, if you had somebody's escaped slave, you were required to give them back,
Mm.
even if it was in a free state.
Oh, geez.
um,
Yeah.
and so Vermont actually enacted a law against slavery, and it's believed Ichabod might have moved to Vermont since he was a free black. He didn't want to be, you know, because a lot of times, even if you were a free black, you know, if somebody caught you, you know, and you didn't have any proof, you could be sent back.
Yeah.
Then Alexander was born in Bradford, Vermont. Father left. They didn't know what happened to him, you know, if he went someplace or, you know, he just kind of went off the records, and nobody heard from him again. And Alexander became an indentured servant. So when he was in, so when he was an indentured servant, he was able to go to grammar school and church with the family
Mm.
that he was indenturing to. So that's what gave him his education. Yeah, and after he finished his indenture, he went on to like an academy, and then from there he went to Middle, finished up at Middlebury,
Okay. All right.
and you know he did farm chores as an indentured servant.
Right.
And I don't know
So
what the
talk to us a little bit about Bill about some of the Alexander Twilight factor legend page. That's a really interesting one.
yeah, I did that in a little different style
Yeah.
because I told you that it's like he's known as the architect of the old stone house, or what he wanted to call Athenian Hall, but it became the old stone house. Um, but he was also, you know, he was the headmaster, he was a teacher. Um, but the legend is that he made he built the stone house by himself with a single ox. But he didn't have any education in construction or anything like that. And to do that while he did stop being a minister for a couple of years, so he could, so he'd have time to do it. But it's like, so the legend is he did it in 2 years, 3 years by himself with a single ox. So he had to carve out all the stone and like drag it all over there, and he had to hoist it up. They're not sure how it got hoisted up. But I've talked to people, it's pretty unlikely that he could have done this on its own. And I don't understand, being at a school, that there's not any documentation of what happened. So we have no documentation one way or the other. But the legend has it, but they got up to the top and the ox refused to come down. And, so they had to slaughter the ox, and they had a big celebration, after that, to celebrate the Athenian Hall, or the old stone house. So that's the legend.
Right.
But as I said, he had a lot of people that really, because he was so determined and he got things done, that he had a lot of followers. A lot of people really supported and believed in what he was doing.
Oh, just saying. So if people want to learn more about your work and learn about Alexander Twilight, where is the best place they could go to?
Well, if they want to know about Alexander Twilight, you could go to the Old Stonehouse Museum website.
Okay.
And it's going to give you a lot of information about him. And if you're really interested in him, you can go up to the Old Stonehouse, which is open now. And it's a pretty interesting place to go up and see. And you'll get a tour of the museum, and they'll tell you about Alexander Twilight.
Right.
If they want to find out a little more about my work, they can go to my website, which is billtulpfineart.weebly.com. And that has a couple pages of my comics work. And it has other things that I do too. And I believe, if people are interested, I think you said it has my email on there too.
Mm-hmm.
If they want to order any books, if they want to order like 15 or 25, if they're in a school or classroom or something, I can give a discount too. Oh, and the books are for, they're basically made for, young adult, high school, maybe junior high, to be able to read on their own. But I think if you want to use them for younger grades, if you're doing it with a teacher, you could go down a few grades, as long as they had somebody kind of explaining some of the information to them. Because there's actually a lot of words for, it's a lot of words for a graphic story, because there's a lot of information I had to pack in there.
Perfect. Well, listen, thank you so much for coming in, Bill, and look forward to your next project.
Well, thank you for having me.
All right. We'll talk to you soon. Perfect.